The work that I do now is all a second career for me. Most of my life I was working on completely different things. I have a master's degree in electrical engineering and an MBA. So I did high tech stuff most of my life, uh, startup kinds of things, either with startup companies or larger companies with startup businesses. But several years ago, one of my classmates from business school asked me to come and work with him. He said he had a couple of companies, small companies, he wanted me to help him run. And after I was there for a couple of years, he came into my office one day and said, I've got a project I'd like you to work on. It's for my father-in-law, Frederick Beekner. And for those of you who are not familiar with Frederick Beekner, he's an amazing, gifted author who published, 40 some books over a period of decades, a variety of different genres, sermons, novels, short essays, memoirs. And one of his books was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. One of his books was nominated for the National Book Award. He's got like a dozen honorary degrees from all over the place. Incredibly gifted writer, but he never did one iota of self-promotion or marketing his entire career. Only one book tour even that I'm aware of through the middle of Iowa in 1979. So his family basically asked me to bring him online and introduce him to a new generation of readers. They knew that, I had been involved in my church all my life, and, I thought about becoming a pastor. So they wanted someone who, was not a theologian, not a publishing industry person, a little more of a, Christian entrepreneur to do this. So in December 2012, we launched his first website, social media. We built a seminary partnership program with 50 seminaries all over the world where we donate copies of his books to their students, sponsor annual student awards for excellence in writing. We came out with 3 new books, even though Mr. Beekner's not writing anymore. He's 95 years old. He'll be turning 96 in July. So anyway, that's what got me involved in this whole Christian publishing arena. And 6 years ago, I turned 60 and said, okay, what do I want to do the rest of my life? I didn't want to go back into high tech. So I started something called Writing for Your Life. And Writing for Your Life is a resource center for spiritual writers. And, my idea was, let me take what I learned in working for Mr. Beekner and help other Christian writers. So I try to give away as many resources as I can. And I do conferences. I used to do marketing plans for people and website development and marketing consulting, things like that. I don't do those anymore, so that I can spend time doing other things like How to Heal Our Divides. So after Writing for Your Life, the second thing I launched is called Publishing in Color, which is a conference series specifically trying to increase the number of books that get published by writers of color. When I first started Writing for Your Life, one of the things I kept hearing was that writers of color are really underrepresented in terms of the number of books that get published. And I heard some of the publishing industry people say, yeah, we realize it's a problem. We don't know what to do about it. So I said to myself, well, I'm not a literary agent. I'm not an editor. But everywhere I've always been, so much is dependent upon who you know and who knows you. So I said, let me start this conference series just to foster relationships between people from the publishing industry and writers of color. So we started that in 2018, and we've done several conferences, both in person and online since then, and gotten all kinds of book deals and stuff. The third major project that I introduced a couple of years later called Compassionate Christianity, and you can find that at compassionatechristianity.org. It's meant to be an online focal point for progressive Christians with a variety of resource centers. And then the fourth major thing that I launched is what we're talking about today, How to Heal Our Divides. And so let me talk a little bit about how that came about. When the pandemic hit, March 2020, that year I had planned to do 8 in-person writers conferences, which all, of course, went away. And I rescheduled or revamped some of those to put them online. But I also started doing video book launch interviews with authors when they were coming out with new books, because I knew that, they were not going to have all the speaking opportunities, the book tours, the book signings, all that kind of thing that an author normally would have when they launch new books. So I said, well, at least I can do something, help them get the word out. So I started doing these book launch interviews. I started doing another interview series through video called Reading Hope in Trying Times. So, so I started doing that stuff. I started reading more and reading a lot of good books about anti-racism, about political divides, all these kinds of things. But what I found was so many of them were discussing, here's the history behind the issue. Here's, how you need to look inside yourself and, grapple with this, things like that, which is all really good and all really important. But there was very little written about, okay, what do we do about it? Mm-hmm. And being a very pragmatic kind of person myself, that was kind of frustrating. So initially I thought, okay, well, let me do another video interview series after the election where I talk to some of these people that are doing something about it, organizations, individuals, etc. So then I thought, well, why don't I turn that into a book and just ask each one of these people to write a chapter and create a book. So around, the middle of November 2020, after the election, I started socializing this idea with a few people. And by Christmas of that same year, I was oversubscribed with a number of people that had said yes to contributing a chapter to this book. So I thought, okay, well, I'm really onto something here. I feel like I've hit a need. So that's when I decided, okay, well, it's not just a video interview series. It's not just a book. Let me turn this into a whole platform, meaning website, social media, email, newsletter, podcast, the whole 9 yards. So that's how to Heal Our Divides got started. The following May, so May of 2021, is when we actually published the first volume. And so if you're not familiar with it, it's got contributions from Brian McLaren, Diana Butler Bass, Frank Thomas, Michael W. Waters, Shane Claiborne, Parker Palmer, and 20-some other people. And the reason why I came out so quickly is because we independently published it, meaning that I didn't go through a traditional publisher. I had a traditional publisher that was interested in the book, but it would have been like 2 or 3 years before it actually came out. I said, I'm too impatient. I wanted this to happen more quickly. So basically from the time when I just started talking with people about it till the time the book showed up was about 6 months, which, I still can't believe that it happened. I mean, to some degree. And so, as you might expect, after that time when I got oversubscribed, I kept hearing about other organizations, other people doing similar, really good work. So that's why I said, okay, well, let me do a second book. And so that's how this one came about. This is How to Heal Our Divides, Volume 2, An Abundance of Opportunities. And this has got another 30-some book chapters, each written by a different individual. Only one of these contributors is also included in the first book. The rest of them are all completely new, and all the organizations are different. In this second book. So that just came out basically a week ago. We're actually going to have our book launch party tomorrow evening, 8 p.m. Eastern time. So again, we took a very similar approach that we did on the first book in terms of independently publishing it. And in both of these cases, I partnered with an Episcopal priest by the name of Adam Thomas, who on the side writes and self-publishes his own books. And he also does book cover design and interior layout and editing for hire. So, he has done both of these books, in terms of that function. And he's also done that for other authors too. Basically, design their book cover, do the interior layout, maybe a little bit of editing, that kind of thing. So that's kind of the story of, how this all got started. You might ask, okay, are you going to do a third book? And the honest answer is I'm not sure, but probably. I've got several ideas. One would be to do another book in the similar kind of vein as these, but I've got some other ideas for other approaches too. So I'm not sure what that will come out looking like yet. So anyway, I'm glad to talk about some of the organizations and some of the people who contributed. Oh, I should say, in terms of the second book, some of the names you might recognize that contributed to this: John Pavlovitz, Lisa Sharon Harper, Jamar Tisby, Bruce Reyes Chow, Adam Russell Taylor, who's the president of Sojourners.
Mm-hmm.
So really very, very grateful for all the people that contributed to these books.
Mm-hmm.
So what questions do you have?
Brian, just to start us off, as people write some questions down and think through some of what you said, could you tell us a little bit about your own church background and where you grew up and things like that, just to get a little bit more of who you are?
Sure. I grew up in a small town in Illinois, south of Chicago, about an hour. I grew up in a church that was initially in a denomination called Evangelical United Brethren, EUB for short. They merged with the Methodist Church to become the United Methodist Church in the 60s, I believe. And so that's where I grew up. When my wife and I got married, she grew up UCC, United Church of Christ. We moved to Indianapolis. We started looking around for churches there. For a while, we went to a Methodist church. For a while, we went to a UCC church. Then we moved to New Jersey, where we live now. And this was 37 years ago. So we started looking around for United Methodist churches and UCC churches, and they were all pretty small. Mm-hmm. And one of our neighbors invited us to come to their church, which was part of the denomination called the Reformed Church of America. Mm-hmm. And I said, "What's that?" So the Reformed Church of America is a relatively small Protestant denomination that formed where the Dutch settled. It used to be the Dutch Reformed Church of America. And so when we went there, it was like the friendliest church that we'd ever seen. It had a critical mass of children's ministry, which, at that time we had one little girl who was 2 and another one on the way. So that's where we have gone ever since. So I think the RCA, the Reformed Church of America, as it's known, has got some parts of the country where it's relatively conservative. In this part of the country, it's relatively progressive, just, for what that's worth. But I've been an elder. I've been a deacon multiple times, in this church. My wife was a Sunday school teacher. We both were involved with the choir programs, all this kind of stuff that we've been involved in, the entire time that we were there.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So here's a question from the audience. It asks, were there some themes you found about what made successful projects and partnerships? Was there like some things that you saw coming up again and again that made for successful projects?
Well, I think, they each have their strengths and their modes of operation. One of the themes, though, that I hear from virtually everyone is listening, as opposed to trying to convince the other person that you're right, right? Which is the mode that all of us kind of naturally fall into, including myself. And by the way, I don't think I'd be very good at facilitating a lot of these kinds of conversations that go on within these organizations. Just because that's not my skill set. And, as much as I would love it to be, I think it takes a certain, particular skill set to be good at that. But, they all tend, the ones, that I've been learning about tend to focus on not trying to get agreement or unanimity or consensus or anything else, really just trying to listen and empathize and, quite frankly, build some degree of trust or common ground.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Another question that's from this group is, are all the authors progressive? And do you expect that fundamentalists or evangelical Christians to read the book, and kind of noting that the divide is so great that we don't actually tend to talk to each other, but at each other?
So all the authors are not progressive. I would say most of them are, partly because, I would say maybe largely even because that's my network. I mean, those are the people that I know. You heard some of these names, right? Those are the people that I work with to do my writers' conferences or Compassionate Christianity. So they're people that I knew. And so when I started, kind of looking for organizations and people that would make sense to include in this, I did it through networking. And so, but having said that, there are several people in both of the books that are Republicans, as an example. Several people who I think are more, neutral, so to speak, try to be neutral, to, some degree, at least at some level. Now, the second part of the question, do I think that, evangelicals, fundamentalists, whatever you want to call the far right, so to speak, I mean, the honest answer is I don't know, how many of them would pay any attention to this. I suspect not a lot, but there's a couple things. One is that we've got to start somewhere, right? I just feel like for us to declare that these problems are so big and so intractable, they're not going to do anything, would be wrong. I kind of, feel like I'm leaving a mess to my kids and my grandkids, quite frankly. And I can't solve world hunger just like none of us can. But if we each do our own little bit to try to chip away at the problem, then maybe it'll get better. Maybe things will get better. And so that was part of my mindset, coming into this. The other part is that not everybody's on the far right. Not everybody is like not going to listen, not going to care, not going to want to talk to anybody else on the other side. There's a lot of people that are not like that. So I think it's more fruitful and more pragmatic to try to have conversations with people that are more moderate, for lack of a better term, less extreme, than it is to try to convince someone that's, waving a Confederate flag in front of the Capitol building or whatever.
Brian, that makes me think, have you encountered progressives, Christians or progressive folks who are maybe just as adamant as maybe their counterparts?
Not very many, honestly.
Yeah.
People keep pointing out that. I mean, I should just say in the media, I've heard, people refer to people on the left, so to speak, that are screaming liberals or whatever that won't listen. I'm sure there's some. My perception is that they're fewer, but that's Brian's biased opinion.
Great, thank you. Another question is, did you intentionally look for essays about internal self-work and external community work?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I focused more on the external community part, honestly, because my target audience for the book was intended to be people that already understood that this was a set of serious issues that need to be dealt with. So basically, they'd already convinced that there was a problem, that we needed to do something about it. So I tried to focus on organizations that were doing some of these political forums, dinner church, racial justice, racial reconciliation, things like that, to try to get more people involved in dealing with some of these issues. But I don't think any of us can get anywhere without looking inside ourselves too.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the first step before you even can consider doing anything broader than that. So I don't think it can be neglected. But again, I felt like there were some other books that dealt with that more than the kinds of books that, I was trying to, come up with, the kinds of organizations that I was trying to highlight that are more, externally focused.
Great. Thank you. Brian, what do you feel like there are so many layers of divisions that are happening in our culture right now. What do you feel like, what are some of the easiest to tackle, and what are some of the ones you're finding might be the hardest to kind of work through as a society?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the chapters that I really liked in the first book was written by Alexia Salvatierra, who is an activist in the immigration space. And basically what she wrote was a chapter that dealt with common mission projects, where this was in Southern California, where it was a church that was more conservative and a church that was more progressive working together on joint mission projects. Having, I think some of them were to do with immigration. I don't think that they all were. But, you know, I think things like that or poverty might be low-hanging fruit, so to speak. Now, another thing that I should point out, again, another chapter in the first book was written by a pastor in Denver, Mark Feldmeyer, who wrote a book called House Divided that came out before the first How to Heal Our Divides book came out. So I read it and I loved what he had done. Basically, he did a sermon series on all these controversial topics in a church that was somewhat divided, not homogenous in terms of, political views or what have you. And what he tried to do for each one of these controversial topics was find some level of common ground that people on both sides could agree on and start the conversation there. And, then, try to have civil conversations around those topics. So I think from a methodology perspective, that's really a great approach.
Great. One question we got was about particularly the racial divide. And it says, and I quote, "So many white middle class people I meet condemn Blacks for a poor educational system or Black on Black violence or not using correct English, et cetera, and do not accept and love their others." And so what are ways that we might overcome this?
Well, there's a couple of different aspects of that. One is, I guess overcoming those perceptions, right? Another is, well, I guess there's two things I should say. One is that one of the statistics that I heard from PRRI, it's Robert P. Jones, who's an author, written some great books, leads a polling research company called PRRI. He told me that 75% of white Americans, I believe it is, don't have any kind of meaningful relationship with a person of color. Maybe they work together or casual acquaintance or whatever, but in terms of any kind of a meaning relationship that you could talk about racism or whatever. So I think the first thing is getting to know people. You know what I mean? That don't look like you or whatever. And I know personally, because I do all this work with publishing in color, right? So I get to know a lot of authors and aspiring authors that are writers of color, particularly more than any other group, Black African-American women. And so, you know what? These are really nice people. They're really smart people. They're really caring people. So just because we hear a certain set of things on the evening news, which happen to be all bad, it's completely unrealistic and wrong to paint an entire race or set of people with that paintbrush, because it's completely wrong. So that's one thing, right? Is to get to know people, have personal relationships, and get to know their view of the world. The second thing is that, I think about, well, what if it had been my ancestors that had been enslaved or segregated or oppressed or discriminated against for the last 400 years or so? How would I feel? And if I still see it go on today, voter restrictions, et cetera, et cetera. What would I do about it? It's just like, it's easier for us to sit in a world where, quite frankly, we've been privileged. I've been privileged. And, well, they should work harder. You know, they shouldn't shoot each other. Well, it's easy for us to sit over here and pot shot, and say that kind of thing. But, read some of the memoirs of people that have grown up in an environment where there was basically no hope, no role models, no good food, no running water, no escape from the mice and the rodents running around, or bugs, running around your apartment or whatever. And you're a kid, and you're a child, and you see all that you live in, and then you see, iPhones on TV, or stars and lots of luxury and affluence or whatever. And you see that people look like you have absolutely no chance whatsoever, realistically, of getting anything like that. What would you do? I don't know what I would do. I hate to think what I would do.
Thanks, Brian. I have a question about a quote that I once heard. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to read it, and I just want to get your thoughts on it. Someone named Adam Bates once said that you can say, quote, all are welcome, but if wolves and sheep are both welcome, then you're only going to get wolves. The smart sheep will go somewhere else, and the naive sheep will be eaten processed. If you welcome Islamophobes and Muslims, then you'll get Islamophobes. If you welcome Klan members and people of color, then you'll get Klan members. If you welcome nativists and immigrants, you'll get nativists. And so, his argument is that refusing to choose is a choice, right? And so, and it's a choice in favor of people who prey on others and who refuse to acknowledge the humanity of those they hate. I'm wondering, here, I'm struggling with that quote, and then how do we heal these divides? And if we can't get people in the same room and have a conversation and listen, but then how do we do that not at the expense of those who are some of the most vulnerable in our society?
Well, we can get people in the same room. I mean, all you have to do is read these books, and you'll find out about a bunch of organizations that are actually doing that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So just because maybe, we haven't been in one of those rooms and experienced it, doesn't mean that they don't exist, and they exist a lot.
Right.
So I think that's an invalid assumption to jump to that conclusion. And, the other part about if you welcome everyone, I mean, and that's all you're going to get is the wolves, I don't know what that means. I don't even know what that means. Welcome, what do you mean if you welcome someone? Welcome them where? To what? To do what? That any kind of vast generalizations like that, I struggle with. Because for one thing, I don't know what they mean. And for another thing, it's like, I don't like vast generalizations, period.
Well, what do you think what are some things that create a safe place for everyone to show up in?
Well, I mean, what some of these organizations do, they have ground rules, right? About how you act, and they have a moderator that enforces them. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure they have challenges sometimes, in doing their moderation and facilitating these things, just like, any other kind of conversation that you would get into. But they pretty much work from everything I've heard and learned.
Yeah, it's sort of like one of our pastors, Victor, often says, we welcome everyone, but we don't welcome all behaviors, right? And so
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Other question. Another question was, what are your hopes for the book series, and how are you assessing and measuring the impact?
Well, my hope above everything else is that we'll raise awareness about all these organizations doing this great work. That's the entire purpose of this. It's not to make money. It's not to make a brand or anything else. It's really, honestly, to just try to make the world a bit better place through these organizations that are trying to do that. So, how do I measure that? Well, that's a very challenging thing, right? You can look at the number of books that are sold. You can look at whether or not the books are profitable. You can look at how many people are on the email subscription list, or Facebook or whatever. And the answer is always, I wish there were more. no matter how many there are. The first book is profitable though, by the way. So about 5 months after it first came out, we broke even. Meaning that we had gotten more from royalties than what we had paid to create the book. And so at the end of this past year, I offered everyone who contributed it that I'd send them a check for $34. My deal with the people who contributed to these books was that I didn't pay anybody anything up front. But I said for the first 5 years after the book is published, if it's profitable, at the end of the year, I'll take whatever the profit is, divide by the number of contributors, and send you a check. So about half the people that I offered that to said, no, just put it into book 2, the creation of book 2 or whatever. And about half of them I sent them a check. So by that measure, it's profitable. And not that I care about making money about it, but it makes it easy for me to say yes to do book 2. Right? Because I've got some degree of confidence that it won't, be a financial, boat anchor. And, unfortunately, I don't have the money to just go out and spend on advertising, right? To try to get the word out more broadly. I mean, if I could, I probably could increase the impact of this just because more people would find out about it. More people would, be interested and then find out about the organizations. But the other part of this too is that all of these organizations and all these contributors are on the How to Heal Our Divides website. And, again, it's not trying to make money off the book. The objective is to try to get people to be aware of these organizations and maybe get involved in one of them. So how do you measure that? Well, I mean, I know that some of the organizations that were in the book 1 had people come to them after the book was published to say, hey, I read about your organization in How to Heal Our Divides. I'd like to get involved. One of the organizations, the 3 Practices, had a few people that came and said, hey, I'd like to be a facilitator. I'd like to help you do your work. So I hear anecdotal things like that. It's not quantified. I don't know how to quantify it. I don't want to spend a lot of time messing with that. Quite frankly, I'd rather go off and do another 3rd book or do other, helpful things than worrying about, that I reach 5,000 people or 10,000 people. I mean, it is what it is.
Do you have a favorite organization or story?
No, I don't have a favorite child either.
Yeah, me neither. Which segues nicely into, have you been able to engage with other generations like children and your grandchildren, and what has been their response?
Well, my kids, are grown adults, so
Yeah.
they love it, and they think that it's a great contribution, and my grandkids are too young, right? I mean, they're between 3 and 9, so they have no clue. But so that's a really good question, though. On my other work that I do, I mentioned Writing for Your Life and Compassion Christianity. We do have a children's book conference that I do as part of Writing for Your Life, and so it's an area that I've been getting more involved in. And on the Compassion Christianity website, under the resource centers, one of the sections is children's books, and it's a vetted set of books that we feel are, this is a team that did this, are good theology and inclusive for progressive churches. Also on that website, there's a broader set of resources besides just books that are similarly vetted and tied to like a scripture reading or a topic, so that church staff, if they're looking to find a children's book resource that is associated with a particular topic, they can do a search in this database and find, if there's anything there. So all that to say that I've been, more involved in trying to understand and promote resources that help us not teach children some of the mistakes that were taught to us, whether it was race or theology or inclusiveness on other dimensions. So I've been pleased, quite honestly, with some of the newer things that are coming out. There are some particular progressive Christian imprints that I follow pretty closely, both adult and children when they have both of those, to try to see what kind of books that they have that, are along this line, social justice oriented, inclusiveness. And I try to do book interviews, with them, or include them in our database or the recommended list of books and things like that. And there's more and more that are coming out.
I have a seminary professor who would say, you got to teach the children right the first time, so they don't think you've deceived them as they get older and learn more. So.
Well, that's like, look at all the, deconstruction that, is going on within like the younger evangelical community, right? Former evangelical, mostly, I guess. They're having to unlearn all these things that were taught to them that were about patriarchy and white supremacy and you name it. So yeah, it'd be nice if we didn't have to force our kids to unlearn a bunch of stuff.
Other questions or thoughts? Comments? Brian, are there enough organizations that you've heard from that you think there will be a book 3? Like, have there been people reaching out? And
yeah, I'm sure, I could it's one thing to identify an organization. It's another thing to have them write a chapter in a book. Right? When I'm not paying them anything to do it, at least not paying them anything up front. So, that's a pretty big ask. Yeah. When people are organizations and people I'm finding right now are just up to here busy. Everyone is so overcommitted. And one of the things I think is going on right now is that, and I was guilty of this myself, I've talked to other people that say the same thing. During the pandemic, I actually ended up having more time because I couldn't do so many things, right? I couldn't be with my family as much as I wanted. I couldn't travel. So I kept committing to more and more things. And now that, we're kind of gradually coming out of the pandemic, not only do I not have that extra time, I'm using up a lot more time doing all the things that I wanted to do during the pandemic. So I'm traveling more. I'm doing family things more. And so I've overcommitted myself. And I know a lot of other folks have done the same thing. So kind of in that environment, asking a nonprofit that's already stretched for resources, doesn't have enough money, doesn't have enough time to dedicate, the effort to put a quality chapter in a book together, for free, is not an easy ask, right? So, in any event, that's just part of the challenge of it.
What gives you hope?
Well, a couple different things. One is that, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of good organizations doing a lot of good work out there, and practical work, not just like making noise or doing something that's superficial that doesn't have any impact. These are organizations that are doing some things that are effective. So I have a lot of hope around that. I also hope that enough people have seen how bad it is or how bad it could get and realize we've got to do something to make things better. Even if we're not going to always agree on everything, no two people agree on anything, I don't think. Maybe there'll be enough people to imagine how bad it could get or have seen it get bad enough that they'll choose to act. Those are two things. I think I have hope for the younger generation that maybe they'll see how much we screwed up, that maybe they'll think a little bit more openly. I mean, clearly on some dimensions, that's the case. LGBT, for instance, acceptance is way higher on the younger generation than is an older generation. I would love to see that be the case on other topics as well.
What's bringing you joy these days?
Well, let's see, all kinds of, I mean, I've got so many things to be thankful for. I can't even, well, I mean, certainly one thing is just the fact that the second book has come out, it's just a big joy.
Is the party in person or online?
Oh, it's online. I do almost everything online.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that we've got these kinds of tools that break down the geographic restrictions is just incredibly powerful. And so, and because I've got a technology background too, I've been thinking for a long time that, we've got to try to do more and more things online, build communities online, not just in person. So yeah, the book launch party Monday is online. So, I mean, another thing, I guess not this past week, but the week before that, I did an online writers conference. Had Barbara Brown Taylor, several other really fantastic presenters. And so anytime I get to spend my time with people like that, I'm thrilled. In about 2 weeks, I guess, a little over 2 weeks, we're going to have an in-person spiritual writers conference in Denver at that church that I mentioned, where Mark Feldmeyer's pastor, and Barbara Brown Taylor and Philip Yancey and Patricia Raybon and several other people are going to be the speakers there. So again, anytime that I'm able to spend time with people like that, I'm just thrilled with. There's a whole other project that I haven't mentioned and is not publicly disclosed yet, but you asked earlier about children. And I'm working on a project along with Brian McLaren and some other people to put together resources for family spiritual formation from a progressive Christian perspective. Again, something that's probably not been done enough and not, not cohesive in nature. I mean, the progressive Christian world to me tends to be very fragmented, whereas the conservative evangelical world seems to be more organized. And I think there's reasons for some of that. But if you look at Focus on the Family, right, did all this resources for family spiritual formation, but from a conservative perspective. If we could build something analogous to that, but from a progressive Christian perspective, that could be a big deal. So I've been spending a fair amount of time in the background working on that. So maybe around the end of the year or something like that, maybe we'll be far enough along to make an announcement. But that brings me hope, back to your question about hope. And it also brings me joy to spend my time doing that kind of stuff.
Great. Thanks, Brian. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We've got your books here and they are in the church library, but Brian would say, get your own copy so you can write all over it if you want to. Thanks so much. Any last words for us, Brian?
No, just first of all, thank you. I really, really appreciate you all taking the time to learn about this. If you have any questions, if you have any suggestions, feel free to reach out. And, whatever you can do to help spread the word, let your friends know about the books. More importantly, let your friends know about the organizations that are highlighted in the books and see what you'd like to get involved in. See if there's anything, I try to present a smorgasbord, of choices, and that hopefully something will really resonate with people. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon. Bye. Well, thank you all for being here. We hope that you'll get a better sense of some of the organizations that he highlights in these books, and